On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 1 o'clock, the Health Secretary has apologised to families affected by failures at an NHS maternity ward. An independent midwife says a higher standard of care could have saved the lives of 201 babies and 9 mothers. Donna Ockendon's inquiry highlights repeated errors at Shrewsbury and Telford NHS Trust over a period of 20 years.
The external scrutiny of the Trust had clearly failed. And this is a theme that has been repeated again and again over many years. So many parents have told us they tried to raise concerns, but they were not listened to.
The Trust has also apologised for the pain and distress caused by its failings. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Shelagh Fogerty.
Hello there, good afternoon to you if you're just joining us here at LBC. I'm going to open the phone lines to you all afternoon on LBC to talk about the time or times you gave birth in the UK and what your experience was like. This is because today, senior midwife Donna Ockendon has published in full, we've talked about the interim report a few months ago, but she's published in full her report into maternity practices at Shrewsbury and Telford NHS Trust over a period of 20 years. We'll get the detail of what that report found in just a moment from Sean Linton, who's health editor of the Sunday Times and who helped very much to expose the Shrewsbury maternity scandal. I knew this was coming, and I very deliberately haven't spoken about it to 2 friends of mine who had, thankfully, took home healthy babies at the time, going back nearly 3 decades now. But I know that still, nearly 30 years on, they are both still traumatised by the deliveries that they experienced. Thankfully for them, it ended in them surviving and the baby surviving as well. But I also know from you, from the times we've discussed miscarriage and the times we've discussed stillbirths and the times we've discussed your maternity care more generally, that this is a problem that is not confined to Shrewsbury and Telford. That many of you have had experiences, and I'm really keen not to frighten anybody and not to suggest that there isn't great midwifery and obstetric work going on in this country as well, because there is, but it doesn't do us any favours to ignore the instances when there is not, and when people are left exposed to terrible danger and terrible suffering and even death and lifelong disability. So I want to know from you what giving birth was like. 0345 6060 973. What obstacles were put in your way? Were you listened to? Were you communicated with? Were your concerns taken seriously? 84850, the number to text, and you can tweet at LBC. Obviously, it would be wonderful to hear from the profession as well, because it's clear that staffing levels in many instances are not right. The former Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, was talking about it this morning, saying that there are thousands, and we knew this already, thousands of shortages of midwife positions, and there will be consultant obstetric positions available as well that aren't being filled. So I just think we really need to give you the microphone today. So we'll do that. Well, we do it every day, but we'll do it very much on this subject. So do call on 0345 6060 973, the number to call. Sean's with me now, Sean Linton, health editor of the Sunday Times. Sean, probably the best thing is for you to take us back to what prompted the Ockendon report in the first place.
Oh, hi, Sheila. Well, thanks for having me on. And yes, today is a culmination of a very long fight for some families, some of whom have been fighting for, over a decade and some even longer to get to the truth of what happened to their babies. And I got involved with some families back in 2015 when we wrote the first story that I put my byline to, which included a warning where it was said that Shrewsbury had echoes of Morecambe Bay. And for those who aren't familiar, Morecambe Bay was a similar maternity scandal a few years ago, which touched on avoidable deaths of babies. And so even then, in 2015, we had the warning that this was a systemic scandal. But unfortunately, the action didn't follow those stories. And it was down to families, Rhiannon Davis and Kaylee Griffiths, particularly two bereaved mothers, who identified around 23 cases. That was the initial cohort of cases where there was questions around the quality of care those women received and the babies received. And again, working with them, I was able to uncover dozens more cases. And this was around 2018 time period, where we uncovered deaths of babies, deaths of mothers that weren't going to be covered by the Ockenden Review at that stage. It was only looking at the 23 cases. And so we published a new story then, and I exposed that there was this sort of group of cases not going to be covered.
A much larger number.
Much larger number. And the families, through myself and as a piece of journalism, we asked the Department for Health to widen the Ockenden Review, and they initially refused. And the Trust dismissed my reporting as scaremongering. And in fact, on YouTube, there is still a video of, I think, a chief nurse or similar Trust sort of person saying that our reports were untrue back in 2018. But eventually, in the face of media coverage, the Department for Health backtracked a few hours later, and they allowed Donna Ockenden to look into any cases of concern. And obviously so we jump forward now to today, where we've got a report that reveals 295 babies died from avoidable care or suffered brain damage, as well as 9 mothers. In all those cases, if care had been delivered better, it could have made a difference in the outcome. So 300 families absolutely torn apart by poor care there. And in total, 1,500 families' cases have been examined by the review, and there have been failings found in the vast majority of them. And I think what was most concerning for me was hearing Donna Ockenden talk about how there are still today concerns about the culture at Shrewsbury and Telford Trust, with staff telling her just in the last few weeks and months that they're concerned about speaking up and that things aren't correctly there, that aren't right there. And I think that is really, really worrying.
It's worrying, but I'm afraid it doesn't surprise me one bit, because of the culture that we know exists in medicine in many places. It won't be all places, but in many places. And it's something that Jeremy Hunt has landed on many times, isn't it, when he talks about the blame culture that exists. Talk us through that and what he means when he talks about that.
Yeah, so I think I have to say, Sheila, that my career as a health journalist began with the scandal in Mid-Staffs and the Stafford Hospital scandal. That's where I really cut my teeth as a health journalist. And, we saw in the public inquiry that followed that scandal by Sir Robert Francis, that there was, again, a blame culture there where staff aren't able to raise the alarm and speak up about things that might be going wrong on the wards. And if they can't do that, that means lessons can't be learned. That means we can't improve services. And as we've seen today with Shrewsbury, the same mistakes just keep being repeated. And I have to say, sitting here sort of, 20 years into my career as a journalist, I'm really quite sad to be reading yet another NHS report that says very similar things around the defensive culture, that families were ignored, that staff were ignored, that staffing levels were poor. These are the same things. And unless we get a grip of this, you and I are going to be having another conversation in a few years' time when another report is published. And at the back end of that are going to be families who suffer. And, a line has got to be drawn at some stage over this. We can't keep having these patient safety scandals.
See, I often talk, whenever we talk about health service and ordinary people's engagement with it, non-health professionals' engagement with it, how easy it is to be treated like a child as soon as you walk through the doors of a hospital or a GP surgery. I stress, not always, but I've experienced it. I experienced it when I was taking my mum when my mum was in hospital and I was with her. something about that relationship needs to change, it seems to me. And it isn't about saying to a doctor or a midwife or whoever, it isn't about saying, I know more about maternity, I know more about delivering a baby than you do, because I don't. I would know it from one perspective, the perspective of the body giving birth to the baby, but the medical complications, the skills that needed, of course we need that expertise and that professionalism. But that relationship has to get better, doesn't it? That communication has to get better.
Absolutely. There is a cultural challenge to the NHS. And, as you quite rightly say, this goes very well most of the time across the country. But the scale of the NHS and the volume of patients that it treats means that when it goes wrong in even a small percentage of times, it's a lot of people affected. And so there is a real challenge there. And Robert Francis said at the end of the mid-staff scandal, he said that there was a tsunami of anger coming down the road to the NHS if we didn't start listening to patients and getting the care right, because people are going to no longer accept it. The deferential approach to medicine and doctors is something. Well, it's something of the ages, it doesn't apply in the modern world, I don't think. And this isn't about saying patients know better than doctors in terms of clinical care, but patients' views and their consent is really important.
And what they are feeling in their body, particularly during labour, is important, isn't it? Your sense of your child and your body is central to that experience.
Absolutely. And I think what we've seen with Shrewsbury is that when things have gone wrong, unfortunately, families have not been listened to. They've been completely dismissed. And in the report today, I was quite shocked to see there's a paragraph there from Donna Ockenden where she talks about widespread examples of bullying of mothers, sarcasm, swearing, and just generally very, very poor treatment of human beings when they're vulnerable. And that is really worrying about what those staff thought they were doing in those scenarios. And I think for me, there's a lesson there about how are we making those staff work? What are we doing to them? And the pressure we're putting on them that means they treat another human being like that. This is a cultural issue. For
if the reason is there aren't enough of us and I'm losing my mind, that needs to be fixed. And I don't doubt that is how some midwives feel. If it's I shouldn't be in this job because I'm not kind, get out. Get rid of them. Make that possible. But you mentioned the Francis report into what happened in Staffordshire. I think, if I remember correctly, he came up with something like 56 recommendations, which strikes me as too many recommendations for something to actually land and be effectively implemented. I wonder...
He actually came up with 290.
Oh, God. I can't remember the number, yeah. There you go, even worse.
And I think that's the problem, that not all of those recommendations were implemented, particularly, I would say, recommendations around staff whistleblowing and safe staffing. And, I think when we don't actually implement these recommendations from reports...
We shouldn't be surprised when the same thing happens again.
Exactly. And I think if this government today and the NHS leadership today do the same thing with Donna Ockenden's report, you and I are going to be doing this again in a few years, and I really, that is the worry for me. As I built a career out of reporting on these scandals and exposing them, but I'd love to be
You'd
out
rather
of
not.
work.
Yes,
but I don't think I will be anytime soon, sadly.
And take 2, even 3 elements of this, as though you were giving just 3 recommendations. What would they be?
So recommendations, I think. For me, there is a broad one around culture in the NHS, the ability for staff to raise their voice and say something is wrong and we need to do something. So that would be one. The second would be safe staffing levels, not just in maternity, but generally. We know that nurses, doctors are working in short staff situations and they can't provide the best care when that situation is happening. And then thirdly, I think there is something around involving families in proper independent investigations of when they complain, so that we can really examine what went wrong and then provide some answers. There's so many cases at Shrewsbury where the families didn't even know that there was an investigation going on, and if there was one, they certainly weren't involved, and that has just got to stop.
Their body, their baby. they have to be part of it, don't they? They absolutely do. And staffing levels, I mean, it's and that's not just in maternity services either, is it? That's across the piece. I know it's something that you write about frequently, Sean. Thanks very much indeed. Good to have you on the programme. Sean Linton, health editor of the Sunday Times, who was central to exposing the Shrewsbury maternity scandal, along with the two mothers that he mentioned as well. Your calls in just a moment. It's 1:16.
Shelagh Fogerty on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
I'm very conscious that although the focus today is on the Shrewsbury and Telford NHS Trust, this is not confined to one trust. That scale, hopefully, is confined to one trust, but who knows? But you have told me time and again in conversations around your experiences of giving birth how poor it can be. Isn't always by any means, but how poor it can be. But even when, as he did this morning, the former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt says 600,000 women are delivered of healthy babies every year, he's right. But amongst that 600,000, there is a great deal of trauma. I know from friends who've experienced it and still experience it, and who I wish they didn't have to look at the news today, because I know it will traumatise them. So even amongst those so-called successful births, successful deliveries, many women and babies came too close to being harmed, or worse still, to dying in the process. And that has to be addressed as well. The Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, has been speaking about this Ockenden report in the Commons today. Let's take a listen.
The report shows a systemic failure to listen to families affected, many of whom had been doggedly persistent in raising issues over several years. One mother said that she felt like a lone voice in the wind. Bereaved families told the report that they were treated in a way that lacked sensitivity and empathy, and appallingly, in some cases, the Trust blamed these mothers for the trauma that they had been through. In the words of Donna Ockenden, the Trust failed to investigate, failed to learn, and failed to improve. We entrust the NHS with our care, often when we are at our most vulnerable. In return, we expect the highest standards. I've seen with my own family the brilliant care the NHS maternity services can offer. But when those standards are not met, we must act firmly. And the failures of care and compassion that are set out in this report have absolutely no place in the NHS. To all the families that have suffered so greatly, I am sorry. The report clearly shows that you were failed by a service that was there to help you and your loved ones to bring life into this world. We will make the changes that the report says are needed at both a local and national level.
Well, let's get to your calls. That was the Health Secretary. He's still taking questions in the Commons on this as we speak.
Shelagh Fogerty on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Lots of you texting about your experiences as well. I'll get to those texts too in just a second. I'm joined by Reverend Charlotte Cheshire, who we've spoken to before actually about her experiences, but I was very keen to return to her story today in light of the Ockenden report. Charlotte's son Adam was left severely disabled after contracting Group B strep meningitis after delivery at the Royal Shrewsbury Hospital, the one under review. That was back in March 2011. He's now 11 years old, but has a developmental age of around 4. And the Reverend Charlotte Cheshire joins me now. Good afternoon to you.
Hello.
Good to talk to you again. You've shared your story with us before on air, but I imagine today is quite difficult.
Oh, it's devastating to read the results of the report. I mean, as one of the family members involved, I knew full well that it would be awful because it's, on the one hand, the positive side is that it is the truth coming out, but on the other side, it's over 200 pages of avoidable harm. And at the heart of it, it's that there are mothers who died who didn't need to. There are babies who died who didn't need to. There are children like my son who have been left with long-term disabilities who didn't need to.
Yes.
And that's devastating.
One of the key findings was parents not being listened to when they received concerns either about the care they themselves received or things they were seeing in their own child. Does that cover your experience?
Yes, it does, without a shadow of a doubt. In the approximately 30-hour period in between my waters breaking and labour starting, I was checked by the midwives at the Telford side of the trust 3 times. And on all 3 of those occasions, I was told to go home and wait for events. Now, in the first instance, sending me home, okay, maybe that was reasonable. But by the time I was on my 3rd visit, bearing in mind that I wasn't feeling any contractions and I wasn't feeling my baby move in this 30-hour period, to keep sending me home, that on one level is staggering. And then moving forward to the morning after Adam's birth, first of all, to the best of my knowledge, there were very minimal checks over that first night of him. And I can say that because I slept through the night. And on the other hand, there are very few notes to indicate that he was checked. As I think I've said to you before, there was one point where the staff just scrawled across all the columns on a sheet, baby pink, warm and settled. Well, what does that mean? I mean, was he breathing okay? What was his heart rate? And then when it came to 6 a.m. on the Saturday morning, it was from that point through the morning that I kept expressing concerns, because Adam was crying with a high-pitched, shrill cry and wouldn't stop. Eventually, the staff even recorded that he was grunting, and they still, they kept checking him, but they kept not noticing.
And was that pain from infection that was causing that? Did you establish?
Well, hopefully, obviously, there is an element at which this is still under contention, because I'm still waiting to go to court. So, for me, today marks an incredibly important day, but it's not the end, because the trust still say that they didn't do anything wrong in my case and they don't accept any liability. So meningitis, as I'm sure you can appreciate in anyone, particularly in a newborn baby, creeps up incredibly quickly. And if you don't notice the signs quickly enough, then the results are catastrophic.
But that's why the regular checks are so important, isn't it, on those new lives? Yeah.
And regular checks, as well as regular and sufficient notes to indicate
what checks have taken place. Yeah.
So that the following staff can see, okay, this is what's already been going on, and this is what's happening next. It's the chain of evidence as well as the chain of action.
What shocks me, all of it shocks me, but is this, women and their partners being spoken to meanly or aggressively or eye-rolling and all this kind, and I've got lots of texts coming in from people who've had that kind of behaviour. I mean, it's you're a reverend, you deal with people, and and I'm sure you deal with people at some of their very vulnerable times as well. Whatever challenges an individual might pose, when your job is to care for them,
Yes, exactly. And if they are raising concerns, whether you believe as a member of staff those concerns are legitimate or not, take time to listen. Because ultimately, as was the case in my own situation and with so many other families who had, in so many cases, no medical experience, our concerns were clearly valid. So to be brushed off, or to be told, oh, it's okay, or oh, it's not an issue, everything will be fine, only to discover much too late that it isn't fine. And then even after that, to still leave so many families feeling as though somehow they're to blame, or they're responsible, or it was just a fluke, it was just a mistake, but what happened to you won't happen to anyone else. Well, it happened to over 1,500 families. And it seemed
in one place.
Yeah.
And that whole business, we know, if childbirth is risky, getting onto this planet is a risky business, isn't it? We know that, but it's about the degree to which those risks are minimised by good care, really, isn't it?
Yes.
That's the question.
Absolutely. And I would never dispute that even now in the 21st century, childbirth is risky. Sure it is. But at the same time, there is so much medical knowledge and so much technology. And at the very least, it doesn't take a great deal of technology or effort to put pen to paper and to say, this is what
human
this
attention
heart rate was. This is what their temperature was, etc.
You would wonder about staffing levels in your case. I would be looking at that, because
and certainly we know that the NHS really struggles with staffing. As Donna said this morning, it's one thing to try and recruit more staff, but if you can't ever fill a bath with the plug out, which was something Donna said today, and if there are as many staff leaving as you're trying to recruit because the conditions are so poor, then you're never going to fix it. And that seems to be the case here.
Is that Adam I can hear in the background? He made his presence felt beautifully last time we spoke. So it's really
he's in the other room on my phone.
You've locked him in this time. I mean, no, I hope not. Thanks very much indeed. Good to talk. I wish you well with your ongoing efforts with the hospital in question. Thanks very much indeed, Reverend Charlotte Cheshire, whose son Adam was left severely disabled after he was born at the Royal Shrewsbury Hospital back in 2011.